Okay, I will narrow the discussion to Finland and Finland's climate policy. Referring to Anna-Lea's presentation, let us ask ourselves that what should the home take messages be from IPCC's report for a national policy? National climate policy. If you think about climate policy, obviously it must be a combination of the latest climate science, like we heard, carbon budget, net zero and negative emissions over time. And of course, every signatory country is tied up with Paris Agreement, where the countries have promised to make their contributions and will take part in the global stocktake. Paris Agreement, of course, has the goals to limit the global temperature well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to even 1.1 degrees. And in this presentation, I will discuss how the Finland's climate policy reflects now climate science and Paris Agreement. You might know that Finland has taken the goal of carbon neutrality by 2035, and we are currently amending our Climate Act to reflect this goal. So to me, IPCC's work with the global carbon budgets give the entry point for policy. The carbon budgets are meant for the whole globe, but we should then be able to apply it at a national level. And the other starting point comes from the fact that by Paris Agreement, every signatory country has promised to pledge its fair contribution to global climate policy. The pledge is the same as the nationally determined contributions that the countries have given and are also agreed to increase their ambition over time. But for us scientists, the question is, of course, then that how to determine countries' globally fair share of mitigation efforts. Science cannot propose normative prescriptions, so how to solve this kind of agreement or starting point? But we know that the climate policy sciences have formulated and analyzed alternative normative criteria on which policy could be based. And drawing on that, we can say that the climate policy research can provide well-examined normative principles for this consideration. And this is exactly the approach that the Finnish climate change panel has adopted. Let's say, most analyzed normative policy criteria for climate policy are called equity principle, ability to pay principle, and historic responsibility principle. They are formulated for climate policy in terms of humans, human beings. So by equity, we should require that every human being has a right to an equal per capita share of global carbon budget. This is perhaps application of the oldest equity thinking that we can find out from philosophy and moral philosophy. Ability to pay principle is more kind of modern approach, and it says that every human being has right to the share of carbon budget that equals the inverse of countries' GDP per capita share. This principle is said to reflect the United Nations Climate Agreement by 1992, where countries identify equal and differentiated responsibilities, where the developed countries take the higher responsibility. Ability to pay principle indicates that countries who have higher economic and knowledge-based ability to work for better climate should do more. And the third principle is historic responsibility principle, which can be formulated so that every human being has a right to an equal share to the past and future carbon budget. So here we account the pollution history of each country and the future emissions. Of course, in this case, we need to think what is the starting point of historical responsibility. In any case, these have been much studied in science policy literature. The Finland Climate Change Panel took as a starting point the global carbon budget for 1.5 decrease with 67 probability, adjusted it to include non-CO2 emissions and the land use sector. And then we solved what comes out from each principle for the Finland's country-based carbon budget. Equity principle gives us 211 million tons if we take the time horizon up to 2050. Ability to pay gives 79 million tons, and historical responsibility minus 440 million tons, meaning that we are only allowed to produce negative emissions. And the reason is, of course, that why a carbon budget on this basis is quite large for Finland, 1,061 million tons, we already have put net emissions by 1,501 million tons. Based on this thinking, these have been provided to Finnish decision makers. The climate change panel's recommendation was to follow this ability to pay principle. And it is kind of reinforced by Paris Agreement, which has a strong Article 4, it points 1, 3, and 4, which reiterate the historical responsibility for developed countries by these common and differentiated responsibilities. If the European Union would follow the same approach and follow the ability to pay principle, that would yield as the EU's reduction target for the 2030, which has been discussed lately, to be 63%. Currently is 55%. Based on this calculation and taking the time horizon of 2050, this shows Finland's net emissions path, assuming it's linear. The blue bars above indicate fossil and process-based emissions, which go down up to 95% reduction by 2050. This is, by current knowledge, the technical upper limit or possibilities to reduce emissions. And then we have the sink, which is set at the historic mean or average value. But we will consume the whole budget by 2050. Therefore, Finland must increase the sinks, either natural sinks in forests or in soils, or technological sinks. By, for instance, in year 2050, the increase in the sinks should be 2.4 million tons. The red line indicates the net emissions, and you can see that the net emissions curve cuts the y-axis at 2035. So this path is the one that has been adopted by the Finnish government and the decisions. So what we have ahead relates also in many ways to what Anna-Leena said. We must run net emissions to zero. We must so achieve the net and then achieve the negative emissions, net negative emissions as we do after 2035, and we must increase our sink. But this is the path. And now that the government is renewing the Climate Act, government has decided that it will state the emission reduction targets for selected years, and this is our panel's recommendation for the government, and this is what the government follows in the proposal for the law. So that means that we must reduce our emissions by 70% by 2035. That means a reduction of 27 million tons from 2020 level. Our emissions were 48 million tons by 2020. That means that we must maintain the historical average sink and start to build new sink. But these are the national goals, and then we need a policy that could implement it. Finland climate policy, of course, like any member state policy, is made within the EU framework. We have the emissions trading, which provides the incentives for energy companies and processing industry, and then we have the mandatory obligations for member states in something that is called effort-sharing sector, that includes transport and agriculture, waste management and some other things. And then we have this land use sector on which EU also sets a target. Looking at those and following a cost efficiency principle, which says that we, for the amount of money that we invest, we would like to have as large reduction in emissions as possible, we could kind of characterize our possibilities of achieving these goals. If you look at decarbonizing of energy, currently the carbon pricing by EU ETS works well. The pace in Finland in emissions reduction is much faster than it has been anticipated. We have challenges ahead. Some relate especially to decarbonizing heating, promoting energy storage, but then we have lots of good possibilities that relate to new solutions, at the core of which is the shift towards hydrogen economy by the first solutions like power to X and some others. If I look at the land use sector's net emissions, we find out, and referring to recent discussion, that we have a situation where we need to keep the sector's sink at the targeted level, but we have also, or we must also trade off multiple objectives. Forest management requires balancing the sink, biodiversity conservation, in addition to the commercial use of trees in forest industry. And then we need more focus on soil emissions, both carbon sequestration and especially to the reduction from emissions from peatlands, which provide a huge potential for our policy. And the third part in achieving the Finland climate goal relates to policy areas that come very close to social acceptability. Agriculture and transport are pretty tricky sectors in the sense that there are lots of stakeholders instead of few industrial actors like in the emissions trading. And of course, decisions here come very close to the ordinary people. So for agriculture, the key thing is aligning all policies to advance both mitigation and adaptation. And for transport, which is the core of achieving the EU's target set to Finland, we need to speed up the shift to electric vehicles and related infrastructure. But overall, I would say we are on the path and we will achieve these goals, and hopefully in a way that improves our competitiveness in the global economic competition. So to conclude, I would say from the science policy perspective that the climate science provides a sound basis for global climate policy. But the national pledges and national policy requires a step forward. We need the climate policy sciences to help countries to formulate consistent policies aiming at 1.5 target in a globally fair way. Finland is on the path, EU is not. We should ask that should EU now raise its ambition to reflect the 1.5 goal. I think that the easiest way is reforming EU ETS, but this would be in line with what Glasgow COP26 message is. And that is all. Thank you.